The acceleration clause. It is the single contract term that converts a missed payment dispute into a demand for the entire remaining price. In a contract for deed, it is the doorway between a seller's two enforcement paths. Fire it wrong and you lose the forfeiture remedy entirely. Here is how it works, where it leads, and what every operator must know. An acceleration clause lets the seller, on the buyer's default, declare the entire unpaid balance immediately due and payable. It collapses a stream of future installments into one lump sum obligation. Crucially, acceleration is almost always optional and elective. The seller must affirmatively invoke it, usually after notice. In most states, it is not self-executing. Without a clause, each installment matures and is sued upon separately. Acceleration is the hinge between forfeiture and foreclosure. The recurring litigated question is not whether the clause is valid. It almost always is. The question is what the buyer must tender to stop the default, and whether accelerating forecloses the forfeiture remedy altogether. Three distinct rules collide when any default notice goes out. Rule 1. Acceleration usually does not change the cure number. In statutory cure states, the statute, not the contract, fixes reinstatement. The buyer reinstates by paying arrears plus then due installments, not the accelerated balance. Minnesota, Washington, Michigan, Maine, North Carolina, and North Dakota all codify this protection. Demanding the accelerated balance as the price of cure is a defective notice that can void your cancellation entirely. Washington states it plainly in RCW 61.30.090. The seller may not require payment of accelerated amounts as a condition to cure except to the extent those payments would have been due without the acceleration. Michigan goes further in MCL 600.5726. Amounts required to forfeit shall not include any accelerated indebtedness by reason of breach of the contract. Maine requires cure of all amounts past due within a 30-day window. Then the buyer is restored to all rights under the contract. Rule 2. In several states, electing to accelerate is itself an election of remedy. Once the seller calls the whole balance due, it must sell the property and account for surplus. It may no longer forfeit. In Arizona, this is codified by statute. If the seller elects to accelerate the principal balance, the seller may only foreclose the contract as a mortgage, per Arizona Revised Statutes Section 33-742. New York and New Mexico reached the same result through case law. In Bean v. Walker, the New York Appellate Division held that the vendor's election to accelerate channeled it into an action for the price or a foreclosure-style remedy out of forfeiture. New Mexico's standard real estate contract gives the seller the option to either accelerate and sue or terminate and retain payments as liquidated damages. Those remedies are alternative, not cumulative. The seller cannot accelerate, collect, and still keep the property and all payments. Rule 3. Equity will refuse to enforce acceleration in two recurring situations. Waiver. A seller who habitually accepted late payments lulled the buyer into reliance. That seller cannot suddenly accelerate and strictly foreclose without first giving a reasonable opportunity to cure. Oregon's Steinmeier v. Wesco Farms is the leading case. Penalty and windfall. Using acceleration to engineer a forfeiture grossly disproportionate to the seller's actual damages is policed by the substantial equity bar of the Skenzel line. Here is the jurisdiction map from retrieved primary sources. Arizona. Acceleration triggers foreclosure only, by statute. New York and New Mexico. Acceleration is an election of remedy. Forfeiture is off the table once elected. Minnesota, Washington, Michigan, Maine, North Carolina, and North Dakota. Cure is capped at arrears and amounts then due, never the accelerated balance. Most remaining states follow the dominant rule. Conditional and contract governed, subject to equity and the statutory cure. In Texas and Ohio, the equity the buyer has built determines which track applies. Texas Property Code Section 5.066. Once the buyer has paid 40% of the amount due or the equivalent of 48 monthly payments, the seller's only remedy is a trustee's sale crediting the proceeds. Ohio Revised Code Section 5313.07. At 20% paid, or 5 years of contract duration, the seller may recover possession only by foreclosure and judicial sale. Acceleration in those states runs through the foreclosure framework. Absent a clause, the seller cannot collapse future installments. The Nebraska Supreme Court stated it plainly in Beckner v. Urban in 2021. The limitations period runs against each installment individually, in the absence of a contractual provision allowing acceleration. Kansas is the principal outlier, where a court sitting in equity may accelerate on anticipatory repudiation in order to foreclose, even without a clause in the contract. In Kentucky and Oklahoma, the entire acceleration framework operates inside foreclosure. Kentucky's Sebastian versus Floyd holds the installment land contract is a purchase money mortgage in substance. The accelerated balance is reduced to judgment, and the lien foreclosed by judicial sale, with surplus to the buyer. Oklahoma codifies the same result by statute. Title 16, Section 11A, deems the contract a mortgage, subject to the same rules of foreclosure. There is no self-executing forfeiture to leverage. For every contract for deed default, internalize 3 rules before you send the notice. First, acceleration usually does not change the cure number. In statutory cure states, the buyer reinstates by paying arrears and amounts then due, not the whole balance. Demanding the accelerated balance as cure is a defective notice. Second, accelerating may lock you into the foreclosure track. In Arizona, New York, New Mexico, and the treat as mortgage states, electing acceleration means forfeiture is gone. Third, if you accepted late payments without notice, equity requires you to give a reasonable cure opportunity before you accelerate. Classify your state's rule before you draft the clause, and before you draft the notice. Buyers have 2 primary defenses to acceleration. First, the statutory cure right. In most states, the buyer owes only the missed payments and amounts then due to reinstate, not the entire remaining balance. Second, equity. A seller who took late payments for years, or who is trying to forfeit substantial equity by calling the whole price due, can be ordered to give a fair opportunity to catch up. The Skenzel line is the backstop. The 3 leading cases are Skenzel versus Marshall, Indiana, 1973, which bars using acceleration to engineer a forfeiture against substantial equity. Bean versus Walker, New York, 1983, which treats acceleration as an election that closes off forfeiture. And Steinmeier versus Wesco Farms, Oregon, 1971, which bars acceleration after waiver of strict performance. The primary statutes are Arizona Revised Statutes Sections 33-742 and 33-748 for the foreclosure-only mandate, and RCW 61.30, MCL 600.5726, and Minnesota Statute Section 559.21 for the cure cap states. The acceleration clause is a tool, not a shortcut. How you fire it can forfeit your forfeiture. Classify your state before you draft the clause. Is forfeiture available at all, or does the contract treat as a mortgage? Know the equity threshold that flips you to the foreclosure track. Know the notice and cure period, and whether the statute caps the reinstatement amount. Every rule on this video is cited to a verified primary source at the Contract for Deed Wiki. The full acceleration clause